I'm Ron Deibert. I'm director of the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto and the author of Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, and I'm ready to start digging deep.
Hi, I'm Mark Sutcliffe, and I'm on a quest to learn from the best. Welcome to Digging Deep, presented by Zen Books and Abacus Data. This is the latest in our series of one-on-one conversations with thoughtful, interesting, accomplished people in many different fields. So a few years ago, Ron Deibert was flying home from Mongolia, and he deliberately booked his flights to avoid landing in China. But his plane ended up being rerouted, and he spent several nervous hours in an airport in Beijing, sitting there wondering if his name would be flagged by the Chinese authorities, worrying that he might be detained. So why would the Chinese have a file on Ron Deibert? Well, for the last 2 decades, he's been fighting surveillance capitalism and other digital threats to human rights. So there's no doubt that Ron Deibert is on the radar of governments like the one in Beijing. He's the director of the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He is a world-renowned authority on this subject. His latest book is called Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society. I'm sure you're hearing a lot right now about all of the problems associated with surveillance capitalism. Is social media a threat to our safety and security? How is data being used against us by giant corporations and authoritarian governments? Is there anything we can do to stop it? We are going to explore all of that today with Ron. We will walk through exactly why he sees social media as an existential threat, how the internet has become an albatross, why innovation has both benefits and drawbacks, why you should care about all of this, and what you can do about it. We will talk about how we still have 19th century checks and balances on 21st century technology. If you care about your own digital privacy and the bigger threats of abuse from giant corporations and foreign governments, you are going to learn a lot from this discussion. We will also talk about why, as a child, Ron prayed to God to become a professional hockey player, and also how he ended up performing in a band with Gord Downie of the Tragically Hip. Just imagine that. Now, one last thing before we get started. If you like what you hear, then please subscribe to this podcast and post a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And also, share the podcast with your network. And if you're looking for more information on the show, if you want to read my daily blog or subscribe to my weekly newsletter, please go to letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. Now, let's start digging deep with Ron Deibert. Ron, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Digging Deep. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I really admire the work that you're doing, and I'm very excited and maybe even a little bit scared to get into this topic a little bit because it is so alarming, really. So we'll get into all of that in a few minutes, but let's start by getting to know you a little bit and learn a little more about why this is your mission in life. So let's go back to your childhood, and what is your fondest childhood memory?
Well, I grew up in Vancouver, and on my mother's side, her family had a farm in Okanagan, and every summer we'd go up to the farm and spend the entire summer there when I was younger, just simply visiting and vacationing. But as I got a bit older, I would do a little bit of work on the farm every summer in Oliver, BC, and so there's not one childhood memory. It's just that experience of growing up in nature on the farm, up in such a beautiful part of British Columbia. Really had I think back just with nothing but fondness of that time.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. And who was your hero when you were 10 years old?
I think it was Muhammad Ali, I would say. I mean, I was really into sports at that age. We're talking 1974. And I was totally fixated on Muhammad's struggles and his fights, the Frazier fight, of course, the Foreman fight. I watched them all. I watched his interviews with Howard Cosell. I loved his boldness, his, the way he questioned authority and wasn't afraid to speak his mind had a big impact on me. Still does. He's, a hero for me. And of course, like a lot of heroes, they're human. And, he had the tragic ending to his professional career and his life, which is sad to see. And things like that have also affected me as well, I would say, recognizing that our heroes are human.
Yeah. What a time that was, too. When you mentioned Howard Cosell, even, it just evokes a lot of memories for me. What did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
Well, if we're talking about, around 10 years old, I desperately wanted to be an NHL hockey player, and I would go to sleep every night. And I was raised as a Catholic, so when I'd go to sleep, I'd say my prayers, and at the very end of the prayers, I would ask God, please let me make the NHL.
Wow.
He let me down.
He wasn't listening. That's so unfair. What would you say is your life story in 6 words?
Well, that one's hard. I thought about it, but I kind of boil it down to do not fear people of privilege. And by that, I mean, I grew up in a very working class part of Canada in East Vancouver. Definitely not an affluent family. And I've seen privilege and people who are elite and elitist throughout my life, especially as I've now become a professor, and there's all sorts of deference to people simply by nature of their birth or their wealth. And I think it's a good lesson to be respectful, but do not fear these people simply by nature of their stature in life or their position. Be respectful, but don't fear the privilege.
What is a mistake that you've made in your life, and what did you learn from it? What would you share on that topic?
Well, we all make mistakes all the time. I feel in a general sense, I wish that if I could go back, I was just bolder, would have seized opportunities earlier on instead of just kind of laying about. And there are some good things that I did, messing around and goofing off like most young kids in my community anyway. A lot of fun times, and I learned a lot, but I wasted a lot of time. And I wish I had been just bolder, seize the reins, and realize what could be done if you really grasp the opportunities.
For what do you feel most grateful?
I think that's an easy one. My family's health and well-being. I have 4 children, and their well-being, safety, peace of mind is uppermost in my mind. I'm just grateful that everybody's doing okay during this pandemic.
What's been the best year of your life so far, and why?
Not a single year. I would say just the time that I've been director of Citizen Lab and the work that I've done at Citizen Lab, being surrounded by great people, every year has just been a whirlwind, and I'm just grateful for that. So it's not a single year.
It's almost 20 years now, right?
Yes, almost 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
What's been the toughest year of your life so far, and why?
Well, that one's easy. 2004, my wife at the time, my late wife, contracted cancer and passed away in early 2005. And that was definitely a horrible year. We had four children, 12 and under, and she was 40, and it was tragic beyond belief. So that's easy one to say. That was the absolute most horrible period of time in my life.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. That is very tragic. What one person has had the greatest impact on your life?
I had a supervisor when I was a graduate student named Mark Zacher. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago from Parkinson's, and I had him as a professor when I was an undergraduate, and then I went away to graduate school, and I wanted to come back to the University of British Columbia, and I applied for the PhD program. I was rejected, and I was devastated. I was at a conference that happened to be in Vancouver, passed him in the hallway. He stopped me and said, "Hey, didn't you apply for the program? What happened there?" And he turned out to be the greatest mentor, such a wonderful role model as a professor. And he definitely helped shape what I ended up doing.
Is there a particular lesson that you think of, that you associate with him, something you learned from him?
He was a consummate academic in the sense that and professor in the sense that he was endlessly curious, wanted to talk to others, wanted to learn. The art of researching drove him. He was fascinated by ideas. He was just an ideas guy, and also just a wonderful man, so supportive of younger students.
Sounds amazing. What's the most important lesson that you've learned that you would share with others?
I think over time I've learned to be as respectful and honestly, as honestly, meaning not just superficially respectful, but just to truly respect others and treat other people with dignity and civility. And also, I would say the importance of ethics. As the work of the Citizen Lab has become more and more intense and has had more of a real impact on the world around me, I recognize that having integrity, having an ethical compass is not only critical, it's actually liberating in a way. Once you start making your life choices with a compass like that in mind, I want to do right, I want to be fair to others, I want to be honest, it actually frees you up because you're not hiding anything. You're not trying to subvert somebody or something for selfish gain. And I find that living your life as best you can in that way is actually really liberating.
What would people be most surprised to learn about you?
I play ice hockey, maybe regularly still to this day. I love hockey, and yeah.
Yeah, just not good enough to make the pros.
God let me down.
Yeah. What is your secret talent?
Well, my teammates may disagree with me, but I would say it's my wrist shot.
Okay, that's good. What is the most fun that you've ever had?
I've had a lot of fun in my life, but in thinking about this question, Gord Downie, who is the lead singer of the Tragically Hip, actually he was a goaltender in one of the teams that I played ice hockey, and he became a friend of mine. We were both fanatic Boston Bruins fans, and so we were part of the Bruins nation together. And as we developed this friendship, Gord and his brother, I play a little guitar. My wife now, I'm happily remarried. Jane Gowan is a musician. And so we formed a kind of private band that we played together with Gord, with a number of other Toronto musicians, called the Meat Lovers. And one of the funnest nights I ever had was we played a house concert for a close friend's 50th birthday. And it was just before Gord Downie contracted brain cancer and passed away. And I have this vivid memory of playing guitar while Gord is singing to Jumping Jack Flash, which is one of my favorite songs by the Rolling Stones. And the house was just rocking. And to be in that moment with one of Canada's greatest rock and roll singers, and I'm playing guitar next to him on that song, was surreal. And just, to this day, it gives me chills how happy that made me.
Wow. I'm getting chills hearing you talk about it. We should do the whole interview about that, Ron.
It was a fun show.
Yeah. What a story. Wow. It's going to be hard to top that in your life.
It will be hard to top that for sure. Maybe if I get together with Keith Richards or Mick Jagger or something, that's the real thing. But
yeah, wow, that's incredible. What is the scariest thing you've ever done?
I've traveled extensively for my work to some pretty dodgy places, zones of conflict, if you will. And there are always times in those trips where I'm undertaking field research, interviewing people who themselves are targeted for surveillance, often with lethal consequences. And so anytime I'm on these trips, Pakistan, West Africa, Guatemala, whatever, it's I wouldn't say scary is the right word, but it's a bit nerve-wracking, especially I have to take precautions for physical and digital security. But the single most frightening experience I had was recently. I was in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, in I think it was 2015, and I had deliberately routed my return flight not to pass through Beijing. And that's because the work that I have done at the Citizen Lab has been very adversarial to the Chinese Communist Party. We exposed major global cyber espionage operations run by China. We've worked closely with Tibetans. I've met personally the Dalai Lama because of the work that we do. And I was mistakenly not mistakenly, that the flight that I was supposed to be on was canceled and rerouted on another flight. I was rerouted through Beijing, and I had a layover in Beijing. And given what's happened to the two Canadians who've been seized now we can see what could happen when the Chinese intelligence may have some information. No doubt they have a file on me. And so I was in that about 4 hours in the Beijing airport. I had to pass through multiple security checks. And I was thinking, this is a toss-up. If I get out of here, I'll be lucky. And when the doors of the plane finally closed, and even then, it wasn't until we actually lifted off and got into the air that I breathed a sigh of relief.
Wow. I can picture that moment of the plane finally getting off the ground and the tension that would have lifted then. What's your boldest prediction for the future?
I'm a social scientist, and I don't like making predictions for the future. I think, the future is not written. There are trends that are moving us in certain directions, but we are the authors of our own destiny. And one can sketch out scenarios, multiple scenarios, and I certainly won't bore you with those right now. I think, generally speaking, things look pretty grim. We are in a period of crisis, and unless we change our tack collectively on this planet, we're really in for it. And the writing's on the wall. So, if I was to make a prediction, I would try to alarm people and say, "Hey, wake up! This is where we're headed, and we need to change that and make sure it doesn't happen."
And we'll get into some of that in a few minutes as we dig into the theme of your book. But what would be the message of your commencement address if you were speaking to a group of students today?
Well, recently I was honored to be given an honorary doctorate at the University of Guelph, and I gave a commencement address there. And really, the tone was about questioning authority and not accepting truth on the face of it, and really being curious, inquisitive, not accepting things at face value or shrink wrapped, digging deep beneath the surface.
And what book, other than one that you've written yourself, what book are you most likely to recommend to others?
I get asked that question a lot, and I'm always a bit antsy answering it because I will say this: when I was younger, I grew up, as I said, in a not very affluent family. I don't think there were even books around our house other than a Bible that no one even looked at or cracked sitting on the coffee table. Maybe, the biography of Bobby Orr or something. And it wasn't until university that my eyes were open to the world of ideas. And so I can't recommend a single book. Instead, I would say, we live in this tapestry that goes back centuries, and ideas are passed from one generation to others in a conversation. So all the way from Plato and Aristotle through to Machiavelli, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Darwin, Freud, Nietzsche, all the way up to today. It's a collective conversation, not a single book. And that's the way I think about it anyway.
Sure. Are there any that sort of have jumped out at you, or any recent reads that you've had that you've said, wow, anything like that?
I read a book called The Union. I just finished it a couple of nights ago about the history of the United States, told around the stories of a few key figures, a couple from the South and others, and this was really compelling. And reading it in light of current events, of course, and realizing just how brutal the history of racism has been in the United States in the Reconstruction period, especially, just astonishing to read about. For example, I knew it, but I didn't quite fully grasp how much of a racist Woodrow Wilson was and why. And now I completely understand why they took away the name of the institute at Princeton, I believe, because of that. And so, yeah, this was a pretty compelling book, very well written. I loved it.
All right, Ron, thank you for your answers to those questions. We're going to take a short break, and then we will continue digging deep with Ron Deibert. We're just going to take a quick break so I can tell you a little bit more about the presenting sponsor of Digging Deep, ZenBooks. ZenBooks is Canada's go-to cloud accounting firm. They are not your typical accounting firm. I know the founders, Colin and Eric. I've worked with them for several years. And here's why I think you should consider working with them too. First of all, they bring a fresh, unique, modern approach to what is a very old-fashioned industry. These guys were working remotely and in the cloud long before it became cool. ZenBooks also uses technology to your advantage. I think this is really important. They give you the tools and analysis you need to monitor your business in real time. That's so valuable right now when everything changes so quickly. Yes, they're a virtual accounting firm, but that doesn't mean they're offshore, and it doesn't mean they're inattentive. ZenBooks combines the efficiency and effectiveness of a cloud accounting service with all the benefits that you'd want from a trusted advisor, high-level advice, and strategic support. Now, here's what I think is going to happen if you work with ZenBooks. You'll probably start out taking advantage of their cutting-edge cloud accounting solutions, but in the long run, I think you'll stay with them because of their strategic guidance and problem solving. Among their core values, they specifically list being candid and proactive. Isn't that exactly what you want from a trusted advisor? Look, even if you're already working with an accountant or a bookkeeper, or you have some accounting staff on your team, I think you should still talk to ZenBooks and learn more about their tools and their expertise. Check out ZenBooks at zenbooks.ca. That's zenbooks.ca. Digging Deep is all about helping you make better decisions, and so is Abacus Data. Most leaders struggle to connect with and engage their audiences. Why is that? It's because they aren't sure how they think and feel and how they will react. Abacus Data can give you the strategic insights you need to make better decisions and to make them confidently. Here's a good example. A major national union was recently negotiating a new agreement for its thousands of members. This had the potential to be a very difficult process. There were many competing interests. So they brought in Abacus Data to conduct thorough and detailed research of their members to learn exactly where they stood, what they were thinking, what they wanted. And as a result, they were able to secure a strong new deal that was accepted overwhelmingly in a national vote. Abacus Data helps all of its clients understand what's really happening in the minds of their employees, clients, and stakeholders. They help them avoid costly blind spots. And they're really good at what they do. In fact, Abacus Data was one of the most accurate pollsters in the 2019 Canadian federal election. Make the one decision that will improve all of your other decisions. Let Abacus Data help you move forward with confidence and clarity. Go to abacusdata.ca. That's abacusdata.ca. Ron, once again, it's a great pleasure to be chatting with you, and I'm really looking forward to digging into the content of your latest book and really the themes that emerge from all the work that you've done in this space. There's so much to talk about there. But I'm curious, one of the things that really kind of tweaked my interest about you is, given all you know about technology and how we're being watched and monitored and the risks associated with that, What's the technology in your life? Can you tell me a little bit about what devices you use? We're actually talking on Zoom right now, and there's risks associated with that, of course. And so, what tools do you have in your life, and how do you manage personally this sort of this dynamic?
Well, so I'm not trained in computer science or engineering science. I've had for a very long time a fascination with information technology. So I'm a bit self-taught, if you will. However, I think I say this in the book. It's often said everyone has, one great talent, if you will, and if that's true, mine has been to spot other talent, and I've been surrounded by these very talented, mostly technically proficient experts. And of course, given the nature of the work that we do, digital security is extremely important. We have to spend a lot of time thinking about risks to us as an organization, but more importantly, to the human subjects with whom we work, who are part of they are the study subjects of our research. And if we're handling sensitive data, sensitive personal data, and it is exposed, it could put people's lives at risk. What type of technology do I use? What does it look like? A lot of it is pretty standard consumer applications, but it's segmented in various ways and controlled by my security team in ways that are meant to protect me from doing stupid things. So meant to be as foolproof as possible. So for example, the laptop that I'm using to hold this conversation with you is managed by my security team. I can't install an application without them coming on. Almost every week, all of my devices are sent through a virtual private network, a tunnel, if you will, to the Citizen Labs network, where the security team will monitor the network traffic to look for anything suspicious. The very same method that we use to investigate suspected targets of espionage. And that's about the best we can do. Obviously, the threat environment that we face is very sophisticated, and there are some attack techniques that one can't even protect yourself against, frankly, given how insecure the communications ecosystem is that we live in. So I have to pay a lot of attention to it. It's very inconvenient. I have multiple phones, for example, personal phones separated from work phone, travel phone. Prior to the pandemic, when I was traveling, I would have to take essentially burner devices, burner laptops. I would, before going to the airport, I would wipe the devices, and then once I get through whatever customs there are on either end, then reboot the fresh devices and connect and get whatever information I need through encrypted tunnels. So that makes it would make traveling in the past prior to the pandemic really quite laborious.
Yeah, no question. And can you describe the Citizen Lab and how it came to be for those people who aren't intimately familiar with the work that you do? How did you end up in that space? How did you launch it, and how would you describe its work?
So the story goes back to my days in graduate school. I was working on a dissertation and doing my research on information technology and international security, and I was contracted by the Canadian Foreign Affairs Department to do some research for a pretty obscure unit called the Verification Research Unit. And as part of that research, I was asked to do a study of commercial satellite imagery and whether the type of imagery that could be purchased commercially at the time, quite poor resolution, could be used for things like arms control verification. And as part of that research, I became aware of this kind of hidden world, hidden geopolitical world of government espionage, of states and state intelligence agencies, and all of the extraordinary capabilities they had at their disposal, integrating technical means and human intelligence to watch whatever they wanted to watch, usually another government that they considered to be a threat. And it dawned on me that geez, why isn't there something like this within civil society and maybe within the university, where we use these type of techniques of investigation to watch governments and to watch companies? And in the year 2000, just prior to 9/11, I was contacted out of the blue by the Ford Foundation, a large philanthropy based in New York. And they asked me to submit a proposal for some type of interdisciplinary work. And so my proposal was for the Citizen Lab. The idea was to create a research group within the university that would combine methods, especially from computer science and engineering science, to investigate largely human rights abuses occurring around the internet and in cyberspace. The idea of using technical means was also quite key, because it dawned on me again quite early in my career, not being trained in computer science and engineering science myself. I became acquainted with people who were, and saw that, wow, they're able to kind of navigate through the internet and gather data in ways that average people can't see, and yet those methods aren't being deployed in ways that I think are politically significant. They were used in very conservative ways to ensure the efficiency of networks and to measure network traffic. And I was thinking, wow, we could use this to verify whether governments are undertaking secret forms of internet censorship. And so that's really how we got started as a kind of digital watchdog. It's grown over time. In the early days, it was myself, a professor, and say 2 part-time student researchers, or 3 or 4. Now it's quite a large organization. We have about 18 full-time research staff and another dozen or so part-time students, research fellows, doctoral fellows, and so on.
And so much has changed in the last 20 years as well. Monitoring this and watching the world, this whole issue of evolve as technology has changed, social media has arrived. I mean, when you started, there weren't iPads or iPhones and all of that. So how would you kind of characterize what you've witnessed and what you've learned as this whole evolution has taken place over the last 20 years?
The biggest lesson I've learned, or the most important thing I've observed, I would say, is that the internet, when I started out looking at this topic, the expectation was it would be liberating, and on the face of it, when you look in a kind of abstract sense at the technology, the fact that it's distributed, decentralized, that anyone can speak to anyone else on the planet and broadcast to a global audience, people extrapolated from that in the early days and assumed that this would bring about democratization and liberalization. In fact, the opposite has happened, and there are reasons for it. Part of it has to do with the business model, what most people call surveillance capitalism, which is about drilling down into people's personal lives, gathering as much data as they can, but doing it in ways that are highly insecure. So security is not really a key characteristic of the communications ecosystem that we live in. And that combination of highly invasive by design, yet also insecure and poorly regulated, has led to extraordinary abuses of power and has enabled bad actors, whether they are autocrats or dictators or organized criminals, to exploit the fissures in the digital environment that we live in to do bad things. Politically, it usually means neutralizing opposition. And I really do believe the disturbing descent we've seen into authoritarianism over the last 10, 15 years, really belying expectations at the end of the Cold War that we were in for this golden age of liberal democracy, has to do with the internet and digital technologies. There's a causal relationship there.
So is there a lesson in that, a kind of law of unintended consequences, that we tend to embrace progress and change and think that it's always going to be for the better? And when we're talking about innovation, we see only the benefits and we fail to acknowledge the drawbacks, or maybe we can't even recognize what some of them are?
Absolutely. I'm not a big fan of universal laws of human history, but if there's one, it's the law of unintended consequences, which is kind of a contradiction in and of itself. But history always takes us in unexpected directions. We do things for one purpose, and something else happens. If you look at, for example, Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press, in the early days, one of its biggest benefactors was the Roman Catholic Church, and they expected this to help proselytize what they were doing, and it ended up having the opposite effect. It ended up contributing to the Protestant Reformation, and being among the greatest sources of challenge to the Catholic hierarchy. And so that's a common theme throughout history. I think the more I read, the more I look at our own world, there's always something unexpected coming down the horizon, which is also why I don't like making predictions as well.
Right. But I guess what I struggle with when I think about it in that context is it seems like we're never able to learn that lesson. And so I worry that, as I can only imagine what kind of innovation and technological advancement there's going to be in the next 20 years, if you look at what's happened in the last 20 years. And I worry about, with AI and with other forms of innovation that are coming, that we'll continue to ignore the risks associated with that. And I think part of what you talk about is how too often the innovation happens before the thinking about it, right? And you talk about restraint in your book, which we'll get to in a minute, but we tend to kind of let the innovation lead, and we catch up to it with policy.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means the horse is out of the barn, doesn't it?
Yeah, and we live in a time when there is a particular obsession with and myopia around innovation for its own sake. I mean, I see this all around me in the university, entire research programs that are defined by innovation, and it's a synonym for something positive, right? And whenever I'm in workshops or seminars, somebody's giving a talk about something to do with innovation, I explain to them that in my work, probably the best example of innovation is Saudi intelligence, how they've been able to innovate and use social media to undertake targeted espionage against their opposition and go out and murder Jamal Khashoggi. That's innovation, right? So why don't we talk about that as innovation? Part of it has to do with a kind of cult of the neoliberal economy that we've been living in for quite a while now, has prioritized research and learning around job creation, almost in a single-minded way, stripping away everything else as secondary. And that's unfortunate, because we need those other types of inquiry as a kind of alarm function, as a warning function. We need people to do kind of what I do at the lab, which is to look over the horizon as best we can and say, we're headed in this direction, and if we keep going here, we're going to end up on the rocks. So we need to change course. And there's not enough of that going on. It's as if the university, and I'm focusing just on the university, obviously, because that's where I'm from, seems to be almost wholly at times focused with this. Oh, we're innovating, we're producing more goods, more ways to keep the mega machine going, and not enough questioning of authority, questioning of the track that we're on.
So let's talk about some of the threats, and you identify them and explore them in your book. And can you, I guess, share what you think are the greatest threats to us right now? What should we be most mindful of as individuals and as a society?
You mean generally speaking, or about the topic of the internet and social media?
Yeah, specifically with regard to the internet and social media.
Yeah. The reason I ask that is I do, believe that there are a couple big existential threats that we face collectively, and this really is the backdrop for the work that I do. Even though my focus is not on climate change, for example, I think it's obvious that climate change presents the most serious existential risk to the human species, and nuclear weapons as well. And you could even add into that now artificial intelligence. I don't think we're there yet, but if progress continues, artificial superintelligence could present an existential risk. There's the risks around the internet and social media. I see them not necessarily as immediate existential risk, more like a slow-moving disaster that prevents us from dealing with those existential risks. And it's as if we've kind of sleptwalked into this embrace of a communications infrastructure that's actually working against us. And I imagine in my mind swimming upstream in a highly polluted river at the same time as we're trying to clean it up, and meanwhile we're drowning, and the torrent of logs and pollution and debris is overwhelming us, and we're trying to clean it up while we're swimming upstream. I think that is at least for me, a kind of way to characterize the daunting challenges we face around the internet and social media. We will need something like it to solve these existential problems that we face, but as presently constituted, social media is entirely dysfunctional to those aims. And if I was to step back and say, well, what are the specific risks? That was really the intent of this book. It was to take a step back and really distill and synthesize what I see as the major pathologies of social media, of the internet. Part of it had to do with just speaking with friends, not necessarily academics, just very intelligent friends and peers in the world, who would say to me, something's bugging me about Facebook. Do you think I should, drop my Facebook account? And what about this device? And my teenager is constantly tapping away, and, people feeling kind of uncomfortable. There's a gestalt in the air. And whenever they would ask me this, I'd have a difficult time answering, because the answer's, it's pretty, to be comprehensive, you have to kind of go through it all. And that the opportunity for the Massey lectures presented allowed me to do just that, to kind of distill this down for a general audience.
Yeah. So if we distill it down, what would you say is, where should we put most of our attention first, I guess? Is social media kind of the front end of this wedge right now?
Yeah, it is definitely the core problem. The way I think it's best to think about it is to begin with the business model of social media. And everything is kind of linked causally from that, in my view. So it's almost like a series of interlocking gears in a big machine that together produce all of the negative externalities that we see, all of the bad effects. And so, starting with the business model, which, as I said before, has been called surveillance capitalism, I think quite aptly. The idea here is that regardless of how social media describe themselves and advertise their services, they are principally about one thing, and that is to gather as much information as they can from their users in order to monetize that information and direct targeted advertisements to them, or derive other sorts of revenue from the data that they collect. In order to do that, they have to make their products and services as compelling as possible. And as a consequence, that's where we see a lot of the addictive characteristics of social media being pronounced. So on a very surface level, the design of the devices and the interfaces that we see draw from basic techniques from behaviorism and psychological methods and techniques in order to capture and retain people's interest. And there's also a content layer to that as well. So in addition to the design of our devices with all of the bells, vibrations, basic BF Skinner techniques being applied on a mass scale to billions of people, there is a selection of content that's meant to be sensational, extreme, emotional, and that's by design. That's the type of content that grabs people's attention. and helps retain their interest, human nature being what it is. And as a consequence of those features, we see a lot of the bad outcomes. So first of all, it turns out to be a very propitious environment, almost perfectly suitable for those who want to sow chaos and disinformation. And so right now we're seeing social media being treated, as I say in the book, as a giant disinformation laboratory. We hear a lot about Russia and disinformation. It's obviously very good at it for reasons that go back in Russian history. But the fact of the matter is there are many governments right now that are experimenting with disinformation. There are many private companies that are making money, deriving revenue from selling essentially dark PR and disinformation services to governments. And then there's the other part of it, which I mentioned already, around the insecurity. So as a consequence of this insatiable desire to push more and more applications at users as quickly as possible, insecurity is pervasive. And also because, of course, there's so much data being derived from people, from organizations, and circulating to third parties, you have, again, a perfect environment for those who want to exploit these vulnerabilities in order to do bad things. And typically, the most serious of them are autocrats and dictators who want to neutralize those who question their rule. Of course, that's something that's almost inherent to human nature, is the type of despotism that we've seen for centuries. But in the world we live in, it's almost ideally suited for despots. So you have their adversaries, dissidents, political opposition, lawyers, journalists, whatever, carrying around with them devices in their back pockets that are invasive by design, poorly regulated, and highly insecure. And that enables those autocrats and dictators to effectively get inside those people's personal lives, find out what they're doing, anticipate it, and neutralize it. And to me, this is an existential crisis right now for global civil society and for liberal democracy. The fact that this is the surveillance technologies that we're talking about that are being used for these purposes, in some cases for targeted murder, are making companies a lot of money. There's very little regulation about it. And we're seeing disaster after disaster, frankly. And then lastly, I would say, are the ecological consequences of the enormous energy consumption that goes into this very call that we're making right now, largely hidden, obscured to the average user, but is growing in leaps and bounds. And to the extent that it draws on dirty sources of energy, fossil fuel sources of energy, we're actually contributing to climate change and environmental degradation, even though it doesn't feel like it. It feels like this is virtual, clean, weightless, magical, but it's not.
Not to mention the hardware too, right? That ends up in landfill. And but there are elements of what you describe that are not different from human history. There were always people trying to get our attention, media, newspapers, television, whatever. There were always companies trying to monetize that. There were always governments trying to manipulate that, or political leaders trying to manipulate that. So what's the element that's changed all of that to make it so dangerous now? And how do we stop that? Because it feels like this is a bit of a runaway train, and that it's very hard to kind of rein it in.
Well, you're absolutely right that this is a story that pervades human history and comes in different shapes and different forms. A struggle for liberty, a struggle for rights, and the struggles in the opposite direction. The struggles by kleptocrats and autocrats to exploit people and subvert systems of accountability. This is the human story. We've been doing this as long as we've organized ourselves collectively. Some of us have tried to think about better ways to organize our lives. in order to have the greatest human happiness, the greatest liberty, and greatest freedom and security. And so there's nothing different.
If I can jump in just for 1 sec, that
Yeah.
I even think, I watched the television series Mad Men a few years ago, and that was all about manipulating people in the 1950s and 60s before there was the technology we have today. But it was the same kind of manipulation. It was the kinds of ad campaigns they were running were a precursor to the pervasive Facebook or Twitter kind of activities today, right?
Absolutely. And I speak in the book about, or I write in the book about Edward Bernays, and there's a prehistory to targeted advertising and the type of techniques that we see now being applied at a whole different level. And this gets to your question. Well, what is different here? I think what is certainly different is the way in which our most intimate aspects of our personal lives are being tapped into now, even down to the subconscious levels. We're to the point where internet-enabled neural networks, having connections to our brains, if you will, are now to the point of, I wouldn't say routine, but they're certainly, that this is something that's not science fiction. And even if you look at some of the health applications, the biomedical surveillance applications, which, by the way, are flourishing now at the time of the pandemic, there's a degree of intimacy, a qualitative shift in terms of the most intimate aspects of our personal lives being turned inside out and shared with third parties, whether they're companies or governments. And that creates an enormous potential for the abuse of power. To me, this is, I'm a political scientist, so that's my main focus is about power, right? That's what political scientists at root do. And I have a caption at the front of the book from Montesquieu. So that, the inspiration for the book is really Montesquieu. This is somebody who had no idea about the internet and social media, obviously, but he knew a lot about despotism and the abuse of power, and thinking about how to restrain against that, guard against it. So when we live at a time when we've gone through this enormous leap forward in the capacity of organizations outside of us, outside of our homes, outside of our most intimate aspects of our lives, to know things about us constantly and then shape us, the totalitarian potential around that is enormous, which is why there's an urgency, I believe, to thinking about restraint mechanisms before it's too late.
Yeah, and let's talk about those in a second. But to come back to something you said earlier, it sounds as though this expectation that we had that technology was going to democratize us and allow everyone to express themselves and create all this freedom, that not only is it accompanied by this darker side to it, but it actually could be overtaken by it, and it actually could be the opposite that happens. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think so. I think that it's technologies don't have two sides; they have many sides. There are many possible ways in which technology can interact with human societies, take us in unexpected directions. The idea of a technology being either liberating or oppressive, I think, is simplistic. Because if you look right now, what we're doing is wonderful. The fact that you and I can have this exchange, you could have this podcast, people can enjoy and learn from what you say and the guests that you have on, and connect to it globally, is something profoundly important and I think wonderful and to be encouraged. So within every technological environment, I think our potentials for things, depending on what our values are, to promote those values, to take us in a progressive direction, but they can also be abused. And that's why we have to be on guard for those unintended consequences, and why we have to be realistic about human nature. I think we often lose sight of the fact that, and it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we have these powerful technologies that seem to come as if from magic. That actually, we are animals, first of all. we've evolved with these, I don't want to exaggerate here, but basically, the primeval brains, our psychology has traits that go back to instincts that have evolved over millions of years, and we can't escape that. And so part of human nature are these not very nice characteristics that are always there. And we have to recognize that there will be people, there will be organizations who want to do nasty things. And so we need to guard against that. And that's how I think we need to navigate in this world, keeping in mind that we've gone through extraordinary changes in how we communicate just within, say, my lifetime. Within a single generation, we've gone from talking to each other on the telephone or writing essays on a typewriter to doing something like what we're doing right now. This is like science fiction. And so when things happen at such a great pace, you're bound to have some pretty bad unintended consequences. There's a great quotation by the biologist E.O. Wilson that, and I'm probably misquoting it here, but I'll paraphrase it, something like, humanity is distinguished by Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions like banks and governments and religions, and godlike technology. What could go wrong?
Yeah. It is. It is funny because you talked about being raised Roman Catholic and praying for a spot in the NHL, and I was raised Roman Catholic as well, and it's almost like it isn't about God anymore. It's about, we've replaced God with technology, right? That's kind of the dynamic that exists. This is the Roman Catholic kind of world that I grew up in was one where God knew everything. God knew what I was doing every day. God could even read my thoughts.
Yes.
And that's what we've got now in a way, right?
It is in a way, except it's, the substitute for this omniscient, perfect, all-knowing creature. All of these very flawed, greedy, corrupt companies and governments that are doing it.
Yeah. So one of the challenges, we can talk about restraint and how we achieve that, but one of the things I worry about is are there, and you talked about how essentially we are all animals who act based on sort of these primitive motivations. Are there enough rewards for restraint? Because I think if we look at the current pandemic, for example, I'm not sure that there would have been enough reward for somebody to stop this from happening. The prevention is, there's no political reward for prevention. There's only a political reward for responding to something after it happens.
That's a really good question. And I don't pretend to have an answer for it, except to say that I think this is where the importance of public education comes in. It's something that, as we talked about, has increasingly been ignored or sidelined. And by it, I mean, the study of human history, the importance of political restraints throughout history, the struggles for liberty, the importance of civic virtue, something I talk about in the book. People need education, and as a collectivity, we need to prioritize public education. And as part of that education, there has to be a component around civility and civic virtue, and what that means and why it's important for the collective, not just for an individual's well-being, not about your own personal success. It's about the role you play as part of a larger society, and how your conduct matters for the well-being of the collective. That used to be given a lot of attention. And funnily enough, you can kind of see vestiges of it, the horrible things that we witnessed in the siege of the insurrection around the Capitol in the United States. When the lawmakers came back, you heard many of them reciting these kind of almost by rote, the importance of institutions and respect for them and so on. And one might listen to that and just think, oh, this is just fluff, right? But at the heart of it is something quite important. In the United States, there's such an enormous, or at least there used to be, at the founding, certainly there was an understanding of cultivating a certain type of citizen, and how respect for institutions is an important component of that. So that's how we have to develop a collective understanding of the importance of restraint.
Yeah. So what does restraint look like? Can you offer a prescription for society? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about what individuals can do. But as a society,
Yeah.
how do we kind of start to put on the brakes a little bit?
Yeah. So the way I think about restraint is, as I outline in the book, it's derived from this tradition within the family of liberalism, liberal political thought, a specific strand that has restraint principles at its core, which is typically known as republicanism. And not to be confused with the political party of that name in the United States. Just like the term liberalism, to be a liberal in the United States is almost a term of disparagement. But republicanism at its core has this idea that big is bad, concentration of power is bad, humans are frail, they tend to abuse power. So we need to architect our political systems in such a way to restrain, to prevent the concentration of power. And typically that's done through checks and balances, separation of powers, and so on. Seems like a very simple concept. And as I say in the book, for most of us, it's kind of like almost like an afterthought. Like it's so deeply ingrained, we don't step back and go, well, actually, this is something that we need to tend to. And are our existing restraint mechanisms up to the job, considering the great leap forward in technological advance we've gone through in the last 20 years? I think not. So if you to give you an example of restraint, if you look just at policing, at law enforcement. So law enforcement, generally speaking, has benefited by this extraordinary advance in technologies that they use for their investigations. Drones, facial recognition systems, artificial intelligence programs, private sector companies that provide them with social media scraping, surveillance technologies, hacking technologies. So we've seen this great leap forward in capabilities that law enforcement use. But of course, law enforcement are like any institutions, human institutions, tend to be prone to potential abuse. So we need to safeguard against that, especially with law enforcement, which is the heavy hand of the state. Law enforcement can take away your liberty. So we need to make sure that it's exercised judiciously with some type of independent oversight. The problem is that they've gone through this extraordinary great leap forward, and actually it's more like a exponential curve. We're just at the front edge of it. But when it comes to restraint mechanisms to prevent abuse of those practices, it's like we're living in the Victorian era. We have, basic safeguards like warrants and, kind of flimsy independent oversight bodies like ombuds offices and privacy commissioners. So we've thrown all this technology and innovation at policing, but haven't invested enough in restraint mechanisms to prevent abuse. And that's simply a recipe for disaster.
So we have advanced surveillance techniques, but we have primitive methods of checking against those, basically.
Yeah, we have, as I say in the book, 21st century superpower policing governed by 19th century Victorian era safeguards.
Yeah.
Right. That's yeah. the gap. And then if you look at the private sector, we need to apply restraints to the private sector. We live in a time, as we talked about, where these enormous big tech platforms have a degree of intimacy with the most personal aspects of our daily lives that is unprecedented in human history. What Google knows about you, what Amazon knows about you, what Facebook knows about you is more than any government ever will. And so the prospect for the abuse of power there is extraordinary, either in terms of the type of, the ways that they handle the data that might put our privacy at risk, but also they might share that data with governments in ways that put our lives at risk. So we need to subject these big tech platforms to similar types of restraint mechanisms. Ultimately, this means setting up institutions that have the authority, meaningful authority, to pry open those platforms right down to the level of their algorithms, scrutinize them, develop new types of laws, privacy laws, other types of laws that prevent them from doing things they shouldn't be doing, communicating to us transparently about what they do with our data so that we understand what's going on and have some control over it.
So what should individuals do? What's your advice to someone like me? I have all these different tools and technologies in my life, and I'm not sure I have the power to do everything you just described, although I can obviously vote for people who are advocating that and raise it as a public policy issue. But what should individuals do?
I recently have been answering that question by saying it's almost unfair to put expectations on the shoulders of individuals for a couple of reasons. It's kind of like with the problem of climate change. What can individuals do? Yes, we can all recycle, we can consume differently, but ultimately there are big structural problems with our economy that need to be corrected, and no one individual is going to solve that. Similar here, especially when there is so much, frankly, subterfuge in the ways that the companies, frankly, trick us into doing things to give away our data, that people are almost from the instant they connect with social media, put on their back foot. They're put at a disadvantage. And that's not even talking about the ways in which the companies employ psychological techniques to make their technologies as unquittable, as compelling as possible. So, individuals are at a distinct disadvantage. That said, I think, I realize that that's not a good answer, and I'm beginning to understand that people want to know, what can I do as a person? And, the way I would answer it is, on one level, it's about thinking in terms of your own digital hygiene, the way that you think about other aspects of your hygiene. Not taking technology for granted, not just using an application unthinkingly. Take some time to look at the terms of service, to better understand where this company is located, under whose rules do they operate, what are they doing with this data. And I realize also, that's a tough challenge. Not everyone can open up this laptop and understand how it works or where it's sourced from or what it does. But I think just a general curiosity, a healthy curiosity about technology is where we could begin. And that's something, again, I think that could be taught as part of public education. It's different than this idea of media literacy that people talk about. QAnon and Donald Trump and his followers are among the most media literate of our times. What I'm talking about is something slightly different. It's about not accepting technology and the big tech platforms at their word or on face value, being very skeptical about what they are presenting and what they are doing and what they are providing to us as services, because ultimately we are the livestock for their farms. This is the bottom line. And once you see it that way, I find you can't help but notice it. And it at least for me, it inspires a certain degree of caution around how I approach the technological environment that surrounds me.
I want to come back to something you said earlier, because what you just said sort of makes me think about just how our society is structured. And I think for a long time, we've thought that if we simply remove obstacles and let the marketplace lead, that everything that'll, the rising tide will lift everyone, and that all the, we create wealth, that everything will sort of take care of itself. And when it comes to things like climate change and the threat that you've been describing associated with surveillance capitalism, that doesn't work, right? And we need to. So it's almost like we need a philosophical shift to saying the very first job of us as society is to create an environment where we are all safe and protected, not to just sort of let things kind of fall into place because we trust that that's going to happen.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that we've kind of lost sight, especially in this subject area. So the internet benefited by the fact that quite deliberately policymakers, especially in the United States, took a hands-off approach. The idea was we are not going to regulate this with a heavy hand to encourage innovation, right? This was the innovation mantra best illustrated around the internet. But now we are seeing, the unintended consequences, the negative externalities. I do believe 2021, for better or for worse, will be the year of social media regulation. It's already in the air. And I think that's both a good thing and a potentially bad thing. All sorts of, ill-conceived ideas may end up propagating around how to regulate this stuff that could make things worse rather than better. We saw a bit of that, a glimpse of that, when Donald Trump started advocating for the repeal of Section 230, important law, U.S. law around internet regulation that he just, zeroed in on because he was upset at Twitter flagging his tweets. So regulation is in and of itself is not a good thing. It has to be pragmatic, prudent, and so on. The way I think a productive way to think about this, and a good way to start, would be locally. And by that, I mean, we all live in a community somewhere. And by locality, I don't necessarily even mean territorially local. We all live in a neighborhood, and that's been really reinforced with the pandemic, especially with a lot of people shut down. Certainly, I feel like I've gotten to know my neighborhood better than I did prior to the pandemic. So coming out of the pandemic and thinking about a reset and how to approach social media, I think we should start locally, both literally and figuratively. Start with the communities of interest of which you're a part, and start thinking about ways that you can communicate that aren't subjected to this type of surveillance capitalism shadow. There's no reason why we can't create analogs or alternatives to the big tech platforms that allow us to share and communicate, but aren't governed by this intense, predictive analytics based on monetizing everything that we do. We need to experiment more in that way at local levels and within local communities of interest. And if more and more people did that globally, I think it might percolate up and help create a better environment overall.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective on that. Well, we are really only just scratching the surface of the amazing work that you have done and the book that you've written. The last thing I want to ask you is a very simple question. If this were like a doomsday clock of sorts, how urgent is this? How close are we to midnight right now? How soon do we need to act before it's too late?
I agree completely with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Their clock was moved closer to midnight, and they actually cited the problems around social media that I identify in the book as prompting them to move it closer to midnight. I really feel like we're creating obstacles, unnecessary obstacles in our way in the road towards correcting some of the major existential problems that we face around how we organize our communications. And we need to understand that in order to solve these existential problems, whether it's nuclear weapons, biological issues like pandemics, or climate change, we need to be able to communicate and share information and debate ideas and think about our collective future. But right now, the way we've set up the system is entirely dysfunctional to those aims. So hopefully, my aim in writing this book was to inspire people to recognize this has become an albatross. It's weighing us down instead of helping us to liberate ourselves, and we need to change that.
Well, I admire you for taking this on and for all the amazing work that you've done. And I encourage people to look more closely at the Citizen Lab and at your latest book. I want to thank you for your time. You really stimulated a lot of thought on my part.
Thank you, Mark.
And all of that is really cool in itself. But the fact that you got to play with Gord Downie on stage, that has completely changed my impression of you and my respect for you. So,
Well, it was at a house party. I wouldn't say it was on a stage necessarily, but in a living room.
Yeah. Even better in a way. Yeah. This has been great. Thank you so much, Ron.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
I've been thinking a lot about what Ron Deibert said about innovation, about how it's treated like this noble ideal, but it can still be a big threat. There are so many great lessons about our embrace of technology and the unintended consequences of progress. I hope we're able to start to practice some restraint as individuals and as a society before so much of this evolves beyond our control. So once again, thank you to Ron Deibert for joining us on Digging Deep. If you enjoyed this episode, please review it and share it with others. That will help us produce more great episodes. And if you want to keep digging deep into topics and lessons like this, if you want to see the show notes, if you want to subscribe to our weekly newsletter or read my blog, you can do all of that at letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. Thank you for listening.